When a black teenager stops to help an injured man on the side of the road, he never expects the act of kindness to turn his life upside down. But what he doesn't realize is that the man he saved isn't just anyone. He has the power to change everything. This is a story about resilience, gratitude, and how one selfless act transformed a family's future forever. Before we dive into this inspiring journey, let us know where you're watching from. And if you believe in the power of kindness, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this. The morning sun filtered through the cracked windshield of Arthur's beat-up car as he navigated the quiet suburban road. Dressed in a slightly faded grocery store uniform, with his name stitched on the chest, Arthur gripped the steering wheel tightly, his mind already on the day ahead. His car, a patched-together relic of years gone by, rattled over the uneven asphalt, but he barely noticed. It was just another day. His shift started in 20 minutes, and being late wasn't an option. Up ahead, something unusual broke the monotony. A sleek black sedan was lodged in a ditch, its front end buried in the earth. Arthur's foot instinctively eased off the gas. At first he thought it was an abandoned car, but then he spotted movement. A man sprawled on the ground, his arm weakly raised as though reaching for help. "Yo!" Arthur called out, pulling his car to the side of the road and hopping out. "You all right?" He jogged closer, his sneakers crunching against the gravel. The man's response was faint, barely audible over the breeze. Arthur's chest tightened as he crouched beside him. The man, middle-aged and sharply dressed in a suit, now smudged with dirt and blood, struggled to focus. His lips moved, but the words came in gasps. "Help! Hospital!" Arthur didn't hesitate. Okay, I got you," he said, his voice steady, even as his heart raced. Glancing at the car in the ditch, he quickly realized it wasn't going anywhere. He looked down at the man again, noting the blood trickling down his temple and the unnatural angle of his leg. The sight made his stomach churn, but he forced himself to focus, hold tight. It wasn't easy maneuvering the man's limp body into his car. He was heavier than Arthur expected, and every groan of pain from the man made him wince. "Almost there," Arthur muttered, more to himself than his passenger. By the time he managed to buckle him into the passenger seat, his own shirt was damp with sweat. Sliding into the driver's seat, Arthur started the engine, silently praying it wouldn't choose this moment to quit. The car groaned, but roared to life. "All right, man, I'm getting you to the hospital. Stay with me." The ride was tense. Arthur kept one eye on the road and the other on the man slumped in the seat beside him. "You're going to be okay," he said, though the words felt inadequate. The man's head lulled slightly, his breaths shallow but steady. Arthur tightened his grip on the steering wheel and pressed the gas pedal harder. The hospital entrance came into view and relief washed over Arthur. He pulled up to the ER doors, throwing the car into park, before leaping out. "Help!" he shouted, waving at the nearest nurse. "This guy needs help. He's hurt bad." A team of nurses and an orderly rushed out with a stretcher. Arthur stepped back as they carefully lifted the man from the car. One nurse turned to him. "What happened?" "I found him like this on the side of the road. His car's in a ditch," Arthur explained, his voice tight. The nurse nodded, her attention quickly shifting back to her patient. "You did good bringing him here. We'll take it from here." Arthur lingered for a moment, watching as they wheeled the man inside. The automatic doors slid shut behind them, leaving Arthur standing alone under the harsh morning sun. A strange mix of relief and unease settled over him. He had done what he could, but now he was late for work, a fact that hit him like a punch to the gut. He climbed back into his car, gripping the wheel as his mind replayed the morning's events. Was the man going to be okay? Did it even matter? "It matters," Arthur thought, his late father's voice echoing in his mind. "You never leave someone who needs help, no matter the cost." With a shake of his head, Arthur started the engine and drove off, bracing for whatever consequences awaited him at work. Would you have stopped to save the man? Let us know in the comments. If you think Arthur's actions were truly commendable, give this video a like. But what will happen to him at work after his selfless act? Stick around to find out. You won't want to miss this. The groan of Arthur's car engine quieted as he pulled into the parking lot of the grocery store. He glanced at the dashboard clock and winced. 25 minutes late. Arthur pushed the car door open, stepping out into the already busy lot. The familiar chatter of customers and clinking of shopping carts filled the air, but today it felt heavier. His stomach knotted as he jogged toward the employee entrance, trying to prepare his explanation. As soon as he stepped inside, the fluorescent lights overhead seemed brighter than usual, almost accusatory. Mr. Oscar, the store manager, was waiting near the clock-in terminal, arms crossed over his crisp white shirt. His icy blue eyes locked onto Arthur like a laser. "You're late," Oscar said sharply, his voice cutting through the hum of the store. "I know, sir," Arthur began, still catching his breath. "But I don't want to hear it," Oscar interrupted, his expression cold. "You're always trying to pull something, aren't you? Maybe you think just because you're young you can show up when you feel like it." "It's not like that, sir," Arthur protested, keeping his voice calm despite the heat rising in his chest. "I had to stop. There was this guy, his car was in a ditch. He was hurt bad. I had to get him to the hospital." Oscar's brow furrowed, his lips curling into a sneer. "And you expect me to believe that? A man in a ditch?" He chuckled humorlessly, shaking his head. "Arthur, you're creative. I'll give you that. But excuses don't pay bills or keep this store running." "It's not an excuse." Arthur's voice cracked, the frustration spilling out despite his best efforts to stay composed. "I saved a man's life. He could have died out there." Oscar's face darkened, his tone dropping lower. "You saved a life? Let me tell you something, boy. The only life you need to worry about is your own. You don't show up on time. You don't get to keep this job." Arthur froze at the word boy, his jaw tightening. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words caught in his throat. "You're fired," Oscar said, his voice final. "Pack up your locker and get out." Arthur stared at him, stunned. "You're really firing me for being late after what I just told you?" Oscar didn't flinch. "I don't care if you are rescuing the president. Late is late. Now get out." The words stung worse than Arthur expected, but he wasn't about to give Oscar the satisfaction of seeing him break. Without another word, Arthur turned and headed to the back room, his sneakers scuffing against the polished floor. He emptied his locker in silence, the weight of what just happened pressing down on him with every step. Arthur's car rattled down the road, but he barely noticed the noise. His mind replayed the confrontation over and over. Oscar's sneer, his dismissive tone, the word boy. The anger bubbled beneath the surface, but more than that, he felt defeated. He had done the right thing, hadn't he? Why did it feel like the universe was punishing him for it? His stomach growled, reminding him he hadn't eaten since the granola bar he wolfed down before leaving the house. Spotting a small diner up ahead, Arthur pulled into the lot, his tires crunching against the gravel. The faded sign above the entrance read, "Maggie's Place," and the smell of coffee and bacon greeted him as he pushed open the door. The diner was quiet, with only a handful of customers scattered at booths. Arthur slid into a seat at the counter, pulling off his name tag and shoving it into his pocket. A waitress with a warm smile approached, her pen poised over a small pad. "What can I get you, sweetheart?" "Just coffee," Arthur muttered, keeping his gaze on the counter. He wasn't in the mood for small talk. The waitress nodded, returning a moment later with a steaming mug. "Rough morning?" she asked gently, setting it down. Arthur hesitated before nodding. "Yeah, something like that." The waitress gave him a sympathetic look before walking away, giving him space. Arthur stared into the swirling steam of his coffee, his father's voice echoing in his mind. "You always stop for someone in need, son. Even if it costs you something, that's just the right thing to do." His father had always been like that, unwavering in his principles, no matter the circumstances. Arthur couldn't count how many times his dad had gone out of his way to help neighbors or even strangers. Back then, Arthur thought it was just something grown-ups said to sound noble, but today those words felt heavier, more real. Still, the sting of losing his job lingered. Hanson hadn't even given him a chance to explain properly. Arthur sighed, taking a sip of the coffee. Maybe he'd been naive to think doing the right thing came without consequences. "You'd be proud, Dad," he muttered under his breath. "But it still sucks." He left a few crumpled bills on the counter and headed back to his car. The hum of the engine filled the silence as he drove home, his thoughts ping-ponging between pride and regret. By the time he pulled into the driveway, the dread had settled into his stomach like a rock. How was he going to tell his mom? Arthur stepped out of the car, casting a glance at the worn exterior of their house. The paint was peeling, the shutters hung crooked, and the roof looked like it was barely holding on. He exhaled slowly, preparing himself for what came next. With a deep breath, he opened the door and stepped inside. The creak of the front door echoed through the small, dilapidated house as Arthur stepped inside. The familiar scent of old wood and faint mildew greeted him, a reminder of the home's many issues that no one in the family could afford to fix. A glance around the living room showed the same cracks snaking along the walls and the damp stain on the ceiling that had grown larger with every rainstorm. Arthur closed the door quietly, as if to soften the reality of his early arrival. "Arthur!" his younger brother Terrell shouted, darting out of their shared bedroom with uncontainable energy. His sister Kira, not far behind, clutched a worn teddy bear as she followed. "You're home early. You said you'd be gone till dinner." Arthur forced a smile as Terrell wrapped his arms around his waist. "Yeah, little man. I know. Had a change of plans," he said, ruffling his brother's hair. Kira looked up at him with wide, curious eyes. "You gonna play with us now?" she asked, her voice filled with hope. "Soon, Kira," Arthur said softly, gently patting her head. "Let me talk to Mom first, okay?" His mother's voice called from the kitchen, low and raspy. "Arthur, what are you doing home?" He found her sitting at the small kitchen table, her frame frail and shoulders hunched. She wore a threadbare cardigan over a faded dress, her complexion pale and her breathing labored. The few strands of gray in her hair made her look older than her years. A kettle of water hissed softly on the stove, ready for the herbal tea she swore helped with her symptoms. "Mom?" Arthur started, hesitating at the doorway. She turned her tired eyes toward him, and her brows furrowed with concern. "What happened? Why aren't you at work?" Arthur shifted his weight, gripping the back of a rickety chair as he struggled for the right words. "There was an accident," he began. "I was on my way to work, and I saw this car in a ditch. A man was hurt bad. He was barely conscious. I couldn't just leave him there, so I drove him to the hospital." His mother stared at him, her expression a mix of worry and understanding. "Is he okay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," Arthur admitted. "I didn't stay long enough to find out, but I did what I could." She nodded slowly, but the furrow in her brow deepened. "So why aren't you at work now?" Arthur swallowed hard, lowering his gaze. "Mr. Hanson fired me," he said quietly. "I was late. He didn't care about the reason." His mother's sharp intake of breath filled the small kitchen. "He fired you after you saved someone's life?" "Yeah," Arthur said, his voice bitter. "Didn't even let me explain properly, just said I was late, and that was that." She leaned back in her chair, her hand clutching her chest as if steadying herself. "Arthur, how are we going to manage now?" Her voice cracked under the weight of her worry. "The bills? The groceries? The medicine?" "I'll figure something out," Arthur said quickly, though his stomach churned at his own uncertainty. "I'll find another job. Don't stress about it, Mom." "Don't stress?" she echoed, shaking her head. "Arthur, you're the only one holding this family together. We've been scraping by as it is. You know I can't work anymore, and there's no insurance. The doctor bills keep piling up. And now—" "Mom, please," Arthur interrupted, his voice firm but gentle. "I'll take care of it, I promise. You don't have to worry." Her eyes filled with tears, but she nodded, her voice softening. "You're too young to carry all this on your shoulders, Arthur." He didn't respond. Instead, he stepped closer, resting a hand on her frail shoulder. "I got this, okay?" he said, his tone steady, despite the storm raging inside him. "You just focus on getting better." As they sat in heavy silence, the sound of laughter came from the other room. Tyrell and Kira were playing a made-up game involving an old ball and overturned cushions. Their innocent joy was a stark contrast to the weighty conversation in the kitchen. Arthur's mother looked toward the sound, a faint smile tugging at her lips, despite her worry. "They don't understand, do they? How hard it is." "No," Arthur replied, shaking his head. "And they don't need to. Let them be kids while they still can." The kettle on the stove began to whistle, breaking the somber moment. Arthur turned it off and poured the boiling water into a chipped mug, dropping in the tea bag his mother had prepared earlier. He placed the cup in front of her, watching as she wrapped her hands around it. "Thanks, baby," she said, her voice laced with gratitude and exhaustion. "I'll figure it out, Mom," Arthur said again, more for himself than for her. "I promise." Meanwhile, miles away at the hospital, the sterile hum of machines filled the room where the injured man lay unconscious. The monitors beeped steadily, a sign that he was stabilizing. His wife sat beside him, clutching his hand, her eyes red-rimmed from tears. The soft beeping of monitors blended with the muffled footsteps of nurses in the hallway as Anthony Crawford slowly opened his eyes. The sterile white of the hospital room came into focus, along with the concerned face of his wife, Evelyn, sitting beside him. Her eyes were red from worry, and her perfectly styled hair was slightly disheveled, a rare sight for someone always composed. "Anthony," she said softly, relief washing over her as she leaned forward and clasped his hand. "Thank God you're awake." He blinked, the fog in his mind slowly lifting. His body ached all over, particularly his ribs and leg. "What? What happened?" His voice was hoarse and he winced as he tried to sit up. "Don't move too much," Evelyn urged, adjusting his pillows. "You were in an accident. Your car went off the road and ended up in a ditch." Anthony closed his eyes, fragments of the incident flashing through his mind. He remembered the quiet road, the sudden impact, and the struggle to get out of the car. But beyond that, everything was hazy. How? How did I get here? Evelyn hesitated, her expression shifting. "The doctor said someone brought you here, a young man. He saved your life." "A young man?" Anthony repeated, his brow furrowing. He tried to grasp the memory, his head pounding with the effort. I remember someone. A boy? He helped me out of the ditch and drove me here in his car." Evelyn nodded encouragingly. "Do you remember anything else about him? What he looked like? His name?" Anthony rubbed his temple, frustration creeping in as the details slipped through his grasp. "No, not really. It's all so blurry, but I think he was wearing a uniform, a grocery store uniform." Evelyn straightened at that, her expression sharpening with determination. "Then we'll find him. We have to. He saved your life, Anthony." Her husband nodded, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Yes, we owe him that." The next morning, Evelyn wasted no time. She called the local police, explaining the situation and enlisting their help. "We're looking for a young man," she told the officer on the line. "He was driving an old car, wearing a grocery store uniform, and brought my husband to the hospital. We need to find him." The officer agreed to assist, though he warned it might take time to narrow down the possibilities. "We'll check local grocery stores and ask around," he said. "If he's an employee, someone should recognize him." True to their word, the police began the search. They visited every grocery store within a 10-mile radius of the accident site, speaking to managers and employees. "We're looking for a young man," they repeated at each location. "Mid-teens, probably wear a store uniform and drive an old car." At first, the search yielded no leads. Managers shrugged, employees shook their heads, and the trails seemed to grow colder by the day. But Evelyn refused to give up. "He's out there," she told Anthony. "During one of their conversations, we'll find him." It was a week later when the breakthrough came. A police officer called Evelyn with an update. "We found someone who matches the description." A store manager from a nearby grocery store said one of his employees was late last week and mentioned helping someone. The manager fired him, but the description fits. Evelyn's heart sank at the mention of the boy being fired. "Fired? For saving someone's life?" she said, incredulous. "Unfortunately, yes," the officer replied. "But the young man's name is Arthur. We were able to get his address." Evelyn shared the news with Anthony later that evening, her tone both relieved and outraged. "He lost his job because he helped you." Anthony shook his head, his expression darkening. "Then we'll make this right. He deserves more than just thanks." The next morning, the Crawfords, accompanied by a police cruiser, set out to meet Arthur. They rode in a sleek black SUV, its polished exterior gleaming under the sunlight. As they approached the address provided by the police, the sight of the house took them aback. The neighborhood was worn down, with cracked sidewalks and overgrown lawns. Arthur's house stood out even here, its paint peeling and shutters hanging askew. The roof sagged in places, and the yard was cluttered with rusted tools and broken furniture. Evelyn's hand flew to her mouth. "People live like this?" she murmured, her voice heavy with disbelief. Anthony didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the house. He felt a pang of guilt. This boy who had so little had stopped to save him, a stranger, without hesitation. The screech of tires and the sudden wail of police sirens outside the house jolted everyone into a standstill. Terrell and Kira scrambled to the window, their wide eyes reflecting fear and confusion. Their mother, seated at the kitchen table, froze mid-breath, her hand clutching the edge of the chair for support. "What's going on?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Arthur, seated near the door, rose slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. He peered out the front window, spotting the police cruiser parked in front of their home, its lights casting red and blue flashes across the cracked walls. Behind it, a shiny black SUV gleamed under the midday sun. Terrell tugged at Arthur's sleeve. "What do they want? Did we do something wrong?" Arthur shook his head, swallowing hard to steady himself. "Stay here," he said firmly, glancing at his mother, whose face had gone pale. "I'll handle it." He stepped outside, the weight of countless stories about police encounters in his community pressing down on him. His stomach twisted with unease as he closed the door behind him and approached the officers standing by the cruiser. "Are you Arthur?" one of the officers asked, his tone neutral, but his presence commanding. "Yes," Arthur replied cautiously, his hands at his sides. The officer glanced at his clipboard, then back at Arthur. "Last week did you assist a man whose car was in a ditch?" Arthur blinked, his heart momentarily lifting. "Yeah. Is he okay?" Before the officer could respond, the back door of the SUV opened, and a man stepped out, leaning heavily on a cane. Beside him was a woman, dressed sharply, her warm smile contrasting with the tension in the air. The man nodded at Arthur, his expression a mixture of gratitude and resolve. "He's more than okay thanks to you," the man said, his voice steady despite the faint limp in his step. Arthur's brow furrowed as he looked at them. The man's face was vaguely familiar now that the bruises and cuts started to fade. "You're the guy from the ditch?" The man extended a hand. "Anthony Crawford," he said, "and this is my wife, Evelyn." Arthur hesitated, then shook the offered hand. "I'm Arthur." Evelyn stepped forward, her expression full of warmth. "Arthur, we've been looking for you all week." Arthur shifted on his feet, his unease returning as his eyes darted back toward the flashing lights. "You didn't have to bring the police," he said, his voice low but steady. Evelyn's face softened. "I'm sorry. We only wanted to make sure we could find you. They're here to help, not to scare anyone." Arthur glanced at the officers, then back at the couple. "So why are you here?" Anthony straightened slightly, his grip tightening on his cane. "We wanted to meet you, to thank you in person. You didn't just help me, Arthur. You saved me, and I don't even know your story." Evelyn nodded. "May we come in? We'd like to talk if that's all right." Arthur hesitated, glancing back at the house. The chipped paint, the crooked shutters, the sagging roof. It all felt like an indictment of their struggles. Yeah," he said finally, stepping aside. "Sure. Come on in." Inside, the air was tense as Arthur led the Crawfords into the living room. Tyrell and Kira clung to their mother, who managed to rise from her seat despite her obvious discomfort. Her cautious eyes flitted from the couple to Arthur, silently asking what was happening. "Mom," Arthur said softly, gesturing to the visitors. "This is Mr. Crawford. He's the guy I helped last week. and his wife, Mrs. Crawford. Anthony stepped forward, his voice gentle. "Ma'am, your son saved my life. If it weren't for him, I wouldn't be standing here today." Arthur's mother looked at Arthur, then back at Anthony. "You're the man he talked about?" she asked, her voice faint with disbelief. "You're okay now?" "I'm healing thanks to Arthur," Anthony said. His eyes swept across the room, taking in the worn furniture, the patched walls, and the faded rug barely covering the creaky floorboards. He exchanged a quick glance with Evelyn, whose smile faltered briefly. "This is my mom," Arthur said quickly, gesturing toward the frail woman. "And these are my siblings, Tyrell and Kira." "Hello," Evelyn said warmly, crouching slightly to meet the kid's eyes. Tyrell offered a shy wave, while Kira clutched her teddy bear tighter. The family sat awkwardly as Evelyn perched on the edge of the couch, and Anthony eased into a chair, his cane resting beside him. "Arthur," Anthony began, "we wanted to know more about you, about your family. What made you stop that day?" Arthur glanced at his mom, who gave him a small nod. He took a deep breath. "I was on my way to work. I saw your car in the ditch, and you were hurt. I couldn't just leave you there. My dad always said you help people when they need it, no matter what." Anthony nodded slowly, his admiration clear. "That's rare these days. Most people would have driven past." Anthony's jaw tightened, his eyes flickering between Arthur and his mother, whose face betrayed her silent worry. "You deserve better," he said firmly. Evelyn reached for Anthony's hand, her voice soft but resolute. "We want to help you, Arthur. All of you." Arthur stiffened slightly, unsure of what to say. His mom, sensing his unease, spoke up. "You've already done enough by coming here to thank him. That means a lot." "Is your dad around?" Anthony asked gently, his eyes scanning the room as if expecting someone to emerge from the shadows. The question hung in the air, weighty and unspoken until now. Arthur's shoulders stiffened, and he glanced at his mother. Her expression softened, a flicker of pain crossing her face before she looked down at her lap. "He passed away when Arthur was 10, she said quietly. "I'm sorry to hear that," Evelyn said, her voice heavy with sympathy. "That must have been so difficult for all of you." "It was," Arthur replied, his voice steady but tinged with a quiet resolve. "He worked hard, did everything he could for us. But when he was gone, someone had to step up, and I guess that someone was me." Anthony's gaze lingered on the young man, impressed by his composure despite the weight of his words. "So you've been taking care of your family since you were a kid?" he asked. Arthur nodded, sitting a little straighter. "Yeah, my mom worked for a while, cleaning jobs mostly, but then she got sick." Evelyn leaned forward slightly. "What kind of illness?" she asked, concern etched into her features. Arthur's mother shifted in her seat, visibly uncomfortable discussing it. "It's chronic," she admitted after a pause. "A heart condition. The treatments, they're expensive. And without insurance." She trailed off, the unspoken truth hanging in the air. "We've been managing," Arthur said quickly, his tone defensive, as if trying to shield his mother from pity. "I work as much as I can to cover the basics. Groceries, bills, whatever we need." "But what about school?" Evelyn pressed gently. "Shouldn't you be focusing on that too?" Arthur hesitated, his jaw tightening. "I had to drop out last year," he admitted. "There just wasn't enough time. Between work and taking care of things at home, something had to give." Anthony exchanged a glance with Evelyn, their expressions a mix of admiration and heartbreak. "You gave up school to support your family?" Anthony asked, his voice low. Arthur shrugged, trying to downplay the gravity of his sacrifice. "It's what anyone would do. Family comes first." "But not everyone does it," Anthony countered, leaning forward slightly. "Arthur, you've taken on responsibilities that most grown men would struggle with, and you've done it while putting everyone else before yourself." The room fell into a brief silence, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator. Arthur's mother wiped at her eyes, her voice trembling as she said, "He's a good boy. Always has been. I wish he didn't have to carry so much." Evelyn reached out, placing a comforting hand on the woman's arm. "You've raised an incredible son," she said softly. "But no one should have to do it all alone." Anthony straightened in his seat, his expression resolute. "You're right, Evelyn. No one should. That's why we're here." "What do you mean?" Arthur asked, his brows furrowing. "I mean, we want to help," Anthony said firmly. "Starting with your mother's medical expenses, we'll cover her treatments, no matter the cost." Arthur's eyes widened, his voice faltering. You do that?" "Yes," Evelyn interjected, her tone warm but unwavering. "Your mom shouldn't have to choose between her health and her family's survival." Arthur opened his mouth to protest, but Anthony held up a hand to stop him. "That's not all," he continued. "We're also going to help you relocate." "This house?" He glanced around at the crumbling walls and sagging ceiling. "It's not safe, and it's not what your family deserves. We'll find you a better place to live." Arthur stared at him, the words almost too overwhelming to process. "Why would you do all that for us?" "Because you earned it," Anthony said simply. "You didn't hesitate to save my life when you could have just driven past. You did what most people wouldn't. And this isn't charity. It's gratitude. You and your family deserve better." Evelyn nodded, her expression gentle but resolute. "And there's one more thing. You need to go back to school, Arthur. Your future is just as important as your family's present. We'll make sure you have what you need to focus on your education." Arthur's hands clenched into fists as he struggled to contain the whirlwind of emotions. Gratitude, disbelief, and unease collided within him. "This is too much," he finally said, shaking his head. "I don't deserve all this." Anthony leaned forward, his gaze steady. "Yes, you do. You've been giving everything to everyone else for years. It's time someone gave back to you." "But—" "No buts," Evelyn interjected, her tone firm but kind. "You've already proven what kind of person you are, Arthur. Let us help you." Arthur looked at his mother, who had tears streaming down her cheeks. She nodded, her voice breaking as she said, "Let them help, baby. You've done so much. Let them lighten the load." The weight of her words sank into Arthur's chest. Slowly he nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "Okay." Anthony smiled, his expression softening. "Good. We'll start making arrangements immediately." The room fell quiet again, the enormity of the moment settling over them. Arthur's mother reached out and clasped Evelyn's hand tightly, her voice trembling with gratitude. Thank you so much." Evelyn squeezed her hand, her eyes glistening. "It's the least we can do." The hum of moving trucks filled the crisp morning air as Arthur stood outside their new home, staring in disbelief. The house was nothing like the crumbling, sagging structure they had left behind. This one was freshly painted, with a neat lawn and sturdy windows that gleamed in the sunlight. The air smelled clean, free of the damp and musty odor that had clung to their old home for years. Terrell and Kira darted out of the truck, their laughter echoing through the quiet suburban street. "Look at this yard!" Terrell shouted, running across the grass. "We can actually play soccer here!" Kira followed, clutching her teddy bear as she twirled in circles. "Arthur, it's so big!" she cried, her voice full of wonder. Arthur smiled, despite the lump forming in his throat. He glanced at his mother, who stood beside him, leaning slightly on her cane for support. Her cheeks were wet with silent tears, her hand gripping his arm tightly. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "I never thought we'd live somewhere like this." Anthony Crawford approached them, his wife Evelyn by his side. "What do you think?" Anthony asked, his tone casual, but his expression hopeful. "It's more than we ever imagined," Arthur's mother said, her voice trembling. "Thank you, Mr. Crawford." "Thank you both." Evelyn stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You deserve this," she said warmly. "All of you." The moving crew began unloading furniture, and the Crawfords insisted on staying to help the family settle in. By midday, the house was coming to life. Boxes were unpacked, furniture arranged, and the sounds of laughter and movement filled every corner. Arthur wandered into what would be his room, a space all his own, for the first time in his life. The walls were painted a soft blue, and a sturdy desk sat by the window. A new backpack rested on the chair, filled with notebooks and supplies for his return to school. Evelyn appeared in the doorway, smiling as she saw him run his hand over the desk. "How does it feel?" she asked. Arthur turned to her, his voice quiet. "It feels like a dream." She stepped inside, her gaze soft. "You've worked so hard, Arthur. You deserve this. And school. That's your new focus now. Anthony and I have taken care of your tuition, your supplies, everything you need." Arthur hesitated, still wrestling with the weight of their generosity. "I'll make it count," he said firmly. "I promise." The next week, the family's transformation continued. Arthur's mother began her medical treatments, which Anthony had ensured were handled by the best specialists in the city. The once exhausted woman began regaining some of her strength, and though the road ahead was long, the glimmer of hope in her eyes was unmistakable. At home, Terrell and Kira flourished in their new surroundings. Terrell often dragged Arthur outside to play soccer in the yard, while Kira delighted in the freedom to ride her bike safely down the neighborhood streets. Their laughter filled the house, lifting the weight that had burdened the family for so long. One evening, as the family gathered for dinner at the large, polished table in their new kitchen, Arthur's mother clasped her hands together. "Let's take a moment," she said, her voice filled with emotion, "to thank God for these blessings and to thank the Crawfords for everything they've done." Arthur bowed his head, but his mind was buzzing with a mix of gratitude and determination. He wasn't just thankful, he was resolute. This second chance wasn't something he would waste. Returning to school was both exhilarating and intimidating. On his first day back, Arthur stood outside the gates of Greenfield High, gripping the straps of his new backpack. It felt strange to be here again, to walk among his peers after a year away. But he reminded himself why he was doing this, not just for himself, but for his family. Inside, the familiar rhythm of the school day slowly fell into place. Arthur sat through his classes with a new sense of purpose, jotting down notes with precision and asking questions when he didn't understand. His teachers, surprised by his sudden return, were impressed by his focus and dedication. That afternoon, as Arthur worked on a math problem at his desk, a classmate leaned over. "Hey, Arthur," she whispered, "you're really going for it, huh?" He glanced up and nodded. "Yeah, I've got a lot to make up for." She smiled, her tone light but encouraging. "Well, keep it up. You'll catch up in no time." Back at home, Anthony and Evelyn continued to stay involved, frequently checking in on the family. One evening, Anthony arrived with a bag of books and placed it on Arthur's desk. "Thought these might help," he said. "They're study guides for your classes. If you need help, let me know." Arthur looked through the books, his chest tightening with gratitude. "Thanks, Mr. Crawford. I'll use them." "I know you will," Anthony said with a smile. "You're going to do great things, Arthur. I can already see it." The weeks passed, and the family began to adjust to their new life. Arthur's mother grew stronger with each treatment, often taking small walks around the neighborhood. Terrell and Kira thrived, their laughter now a constant backdrop in the house. One evening, as the family sat together on the porch, Arthur turned to his mother. "You doing okay, Mom?" he asked softly. She smiled at him, her face illuminated by the golden light of the setting sun. "I'm better than I've been in years, thanks to you. And thanks to them." Arthur nodded, the weight of her words settling into his chest. "I'll keep working hard," he said. "I'll make this second chance count." She reached over and squeezed his hand. "You already are, baby. You already are." Over the next few months, Arthur's teachers began noticing his unwavering focus and determination. In math class, he raised his hand to solve equations that had stumped his peers. In English, his essays reflected a depth of thought that caught his teachers' attention. By the end of his first semester back, Arthur had become a standout student. One afternoon, as Arthur packed his books, his guidance counselor, Mr. Lopez, called him into the office. "Arthur," he began, glancing over a stack of papers, "your progress has been remarkable. You've gone from being out of school to earning some of the best grades in your class." Arthur smiled humbly. "Thank you, Mr. Lopez. I've had a lot of help." Lopez nodded. "I hear you're thinking about college." "I am," Arthur admitted, though the thought still felt like a distant dream. "I want to make something of myself, for my family." "Well, you're on track for that," Lopez said, sliding a glossy brochure across the desk. "This is for Washington University. It's prestigious. But I think you've got what it takes." Arthur stared at the brochure, the weight of the opportunity settling in. "I'll do my best," he promised. Throughout Arthur's high school journey, Anthony Crawford remained a steady presence. He would visit regularly, bringing Arthur books, discussing his goals, and offering advice from his own experiences. Over time, their relationship evolved from one of gratitude to genuine mentorship. "You know, Arthur," Anthony said during one of their conversations, "hard work beats talent when talent doesn't work hard. And you've got both, but the real key is discipline." Arthur nodded, committing those words to memory. He carried them with him through every exam, every late-night study session, and every challenge that came his way. When the acceptance letter from Washington University arrived, Arthur felt as if the entire weight of his family's struggles had shifted. Standing in their kitchen, surrounded by his mother and siblings, he read the letter aloud. "Dear Arthur," he began, his voice shaking, "we are pleased to offer you admission to Washington University." Terrell cheered, and Kira hugged him tightly, her small arms barely reaching around his waist. His mother, tears streaming down her face, clasped his hand. "Your dad would be so proud," she said softly. "We all are." College life was a whirlwind, but Arthur thrived. He immersed himself in his studies, majoring in business administration. The hours were long, the coursework challenging, but Arthur tackled each day with the same determination that had carried him through high school. Anthony stayed involved, frequently checking in to ensure Arthur had everything he needed. "Remember, college is more than just academics," Anthony advised during one of their phone calls. "Build connections, network, and take every opportunity to learn outside the classroom." Arthur took the advice to heart, joining student organizations, interning during summers, and forging relationships with mentors and peers. By his final year, he was not only excelling academically, but had also gained a reputation as a leader among his classmates. Graduation day was a celebration unlike anything Arthur had ever experienced. Wearing his cap and gown, he walked across the stage to thunderous applause. His family sat in the audience, their pride unmistakable. Anthony and Evelyn were there too, clapping and beaming as if Arthur were one of their own. As the ceremony ended, Anthony approached him, shaking his hand firmly. "Congratulations, Arthur. This is only the beginning." Arthur grinned. "Thanks to you, Mr. Crawford, I wouldn't be here without you." Anthony shook his head. "You worked for this, Arthur. All I did was help you see your potential." Shortly after graduation, Anthony offered Arthur a position at his company, Crawford Industries. "It's an entry-level role," he explained, "but if you put in the same effort you've shown in school, I have no doubt you'll rise quickly." Arthur accepted eagerly, ready to prove himself once again. The transition from student to professional was daunting, but Arthur embraced the challenge. He threw himself into his work, staying late, asking questions, and learning from everyone around him. Within a few years, his dedication paid off. Arthur's innovative ideas and strong leadership skills caught the attention of senior executives. He was promoted multiple times, each step bringing him closer to his ultimate goal. Arthur stood by the large glass window in his office, the city skyline illuminated by the golden hues of the setting sun. The office, spacious and elegantly furnished, was a far cry from anything he had ever imagined as a young boy. He'd spent countless nights here, poring over strategies and reports, but tonight felt different. The soft knock on his door startled him from his thoughts. "Come in," he said, his voice steady. The door opened, and Anthony Crawford stepped inside, his presence as commanding as ever but tempered with a warmth of familiarity. "You've been hard to catch these days," Anthony said, smiling. "Busy, I assume?" Arthur chuckled, motioning for him to take a seat. Busy doesn't even begin to cover it. But it's good to see you, Mr. Crawford. Anthony eased into the chair opposite Arthur's desk, leaning on his cane, a reminder of how their journey together had begun. It's good to see you too, Arthur. Or should I say, Mr. Executive now? Arthur laughed, shaking his head. Arthur's just fine. For a moment, silence settled between them, comfortable but loaded with unspoken gratitude and reflection. Arthur leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk. I've been meaning to talk to you. I don't think I've ever properly thanked you, Mr. Crawford. Anthony raised an eyebrow. Thanked me? For what? For everything, Arthur said earnestly. You didn't just help me, you saved my family. When I think about where we were and where we are now, I can't imagine how different things would have been if you hadn't stepped in. Anthony tilted his head, his expression soft but firm. Arthur, I only gave you a hand. You're the one who pulled yourself up. Don't sell yourself short. Arthur shook his head. No, it's more than that. You saw something in me that I didn't even see in myself. He paused, his voice thick with emotion. You made it possible for me to dream again. Anthony leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. Arthur, let me tell you something. When I woke up in that hospital bed and found out what you did for me, I realized I owed you more than just gratitude. You risked everything for a stranger, and that kind of heart, that kind of integrity, it's rare. Arthur smiled faintly. It didn't feel like a choice. My dad always said you help people no matter what. It's what he would have done. Anthony nodded. And it's what made me want to help you. But let's not forget, Arthur. You did the hard work. You went back to school, got your degree, and climbed your way to the top. I may have opened the door, but you're the one who walked through it. Arthur's gaze dropped to the polished surface of his desk. Still, I don't think I'd ever be here without you. My mom, she's healthy now, working part-time because she wants to, not because she has to. Terrell and Kira, they're thriving. I was able to send them both to college, and that's because of you. Anthony smiled warmly. That's because of you, Arthur. Your determination, your sacrifices. You built this life for them. Arthur leaned back, exhaling deeply. It's funny, he said after a moment. When I was younger, I used to think success meant having money, driving a nice car, living in a big house. But now I realize it's so much more. It's about family, about the people you help along the way. Anthony nodded, his voice thoughtful. It's true. Success is hollow if it's not shared. And Arthur, I think you've learned that better than most. Look at everything you've done. Not just for your family, but for this company. You've made an impact. Arthur smiled, his mind flashing back to those early days, struggling to balance school, work, and his family's needs. It wasn't easy, he admitted, but every time I wanted to give up, I thought about my mom, about my dad, about what you and Mrs. Crawford did for us. That kept me going. And that's what makes you remarkable, Arthur, Anthony said. You've taken every challenge life threw at you and turned it into fuel. There was a long pause, both men reflecting on the years that had passed since their lives first intersected. Finally, Arthur broke the silence, his tone lighter. You know, Mr. Crawford, sometimes I wonder, what if I hadn't stopped that day? What if I had just driven past? Anthony smiled knowingly. I think about that too, and every time I thank God that you did stop, because you didn't just save my life, Arthur. You changed it. Arthur looked at him surprised. Changed it? Anthony nodded. That day reminded me of what really matters. It made me look at my own life. How much time I spent chasing success, overlooking the people who mattered most. You brought me back to what's important. Family, connection, gratitude. Arthur's throat tightened, and he nodded slowly. It's funny how one moment can change everything. Exactly, Anthony said, his tone full of warmth. We both walked away from that day different people, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across the office. Anthony stood leaning on his cane. Well, I should let you get back to work. I hear the executive life is pretty demanding." Arthur grinned, standing to shake his hand. "Only because you set the bar so high." Anthony chuckled. "You're setting your own bar now, Arthur, and something tells me you're going to keep raising it." As Anthony headed for the door, he paused and turned back. "Oh, and Arthur, don't forget, when the time comes, you'll have the chance to help someone else. Don't waste it." "I won't," Arthur said, his voice firm. "You have my word." Years had passed since Arthur's journey began. Now a well-respected executive, he had built not only a successful career, but also a reputation for his philanthropic work. From funding scholarships for underprivileged students to investing in community programs, Arthur ensured his position was a tool for positive change. Anthony Crawford, now retired, sat in the audience that evening, his wife Evelyn by his side. Watching Arthur speak, Anthony couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride. The boy who once saved his life had become a man whose kindness and determination inspired others. "He's everything we hoped he'd become," Evelyn whispered, her hand resting on Anthony's. "And more," Anthony replied, his voice tinged with emotion. The next weekend, Arthur drove through the peaceful streets of his mother's neighborhood. The modest home he had purchased for her stood bright and inviting, surrounded by a neat yard where Terrell and Kira, now often hosting friends, as he pulled into the driveway, the smell of his mother's cooking wafted through the air. Inside, the family gathered around the dining table, their laughter filling the room. Arthur's mother, healthier and more vibrant than ever, set down a steaming dish of her famous jambalaya. "You've been working too hard again," she chided, her tone half serious. "You need to sit down and eat." "I miss this," Arthur admitted, as he hugged her, his heart full. Terrell and Kira, now young adults themselves, teased him relentlessly about his busy schedule, but their pride in their older brother was unmistakable. After dinner, Arthur stepped outside, leaning against the porch railing as the stars twinkled above. His mother joined him, her smile soft and knowing. "You've come so far, Arthur," she said. "Your dad would be proud." Arthur looked down, her words sinking deep into his chest. "I think about him a lot," he admitted, "especially what he used to say about helping others." His mother nodded. "And look at everything you've done because of that. You've honored him in the best way." Thank you for watching till the end. If you enjoyed the story, please give this video a like and subscribe for more.